right. Good afternoon and evening, depending on where you're calling in from. I'm Allison Wiper, the Artist Knowledge Manager at Center for Cultural Innovation. I am calling in from Los Angeles, and at this point, I want to honor the Tongva people on whose land I am now living, and the elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land through the generations. And I'd like to additionally acknowledge my own ancestors' role in the colonization of these and other traditional lands, and the lands that we're occupying through virtual space and connecting today as we are, and the ways in which these technologies we are using today are part of continuing history of colonization. I am, for those who'd like a visual description, I am a middle-aged white woman with short hair and a little bit of COVID streak going on, and wearing an orange and white graphic t-shirt. You may see that we have live transcript, just sort of automatic transcript happening. If that's annoying, you can turn that off in the little toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom. And I believe the transcript will be available either with the recording or I'll send it along separately if it's not. And yeah, so we have a little prompt to drop stuff into the chat if you're able. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Janelle. Take it away.
Hi, friends. I'm Janelle Orsi, based in Oakland, currently today in Oregon on the stolen lands of the Cooperative people. And I'm really excited to be with you all. I have a lot of visuals here today. And actually, I put in the chat just as people are kind of coming in. If you want to introduce yourself, I know who a lot of you are because I saw your registration, but you all may not know each other, just like where are you based and what's your role? It'd be good to see who's here. So thank you. I also will drop in again a link to these slides because these slides are full of resources. And here we go. So you're welcome to be in the slides, checking it out and clicking on things. I see folks adding stuff to the chat. And while you do that, I'm going to just go ahead and get started. Say a little bit more about me and our agenda. I'm going to spend maybe half the time talking because, I was asked to share a lot of tools and help people understand more about the structure of cooperatives. And then try to spend the rest of the second half. We could kind of choose our own adventure and go deeper into questions related to law and structure, or we can just do a lot of discussion and Q&A or use some of your work as case studies. We can just kind of play it by ear. And it'll be a DIY break, possibly, meaning feel free to turn your camera off and take a break if you need to. I might not actually structure in a break just because I want to make the most of this time with you all. So that's the rough agenda. And I wanted to flag that right at the top of the slideshow is your choose your own adventure to all kinds of other resources. You can come back and click on, we have a lot of resources related to real estate and worker cooperatives and finance. And it's a lot of cartoons and slideshows and legal guides. So all that is there for you to peruse at your leisure. So a little bit about me. I am co-founder of Sustainable Economies Law Center. We're about 11 and a half years old. I'll say a little bit more about what we do, but one fun fact is that we're a nonprofit structured like a worker cooperative. We didn't start that way because we kind of started out as a ragtag bunch of volunteers just doing a lot of things together. But as we started to get funding and formalize this as like a place where people have jobs, about 3 years into it, we structured ourselves like a worker cooperative. So I have a lot to share if people are interested in just like, what is it like to kind of take an organization and turn it into a cooperative? There's lots of unlearning and trial and error in that process. And just like, what is it like to be in a cooperative? And I like to say cooperatives are like snowflakes, like there's maybe some core structural things that they hold in common, but they really manifest in so many different ways. So I can speak from experience about how things have emerged in our cooperative, but also from a lot of the clients we serve, because we are a bunch of lawyers who provide legal support and resources to cooperatives of all kinds everywhere. There's a link here to a little bit more about what it means to be a worker self-directed nonprofit or a cooperatively structured nonprofit. So you can go back to that if you're interested. I guess one thing, I'm excited to be here with artists and creative people today, because I feel like there's sort of like this infinity loop between cooperation and creativity, where having been part of a cooperative and like functioning in small collective groups for the last decade or more, I can see like that is where so much creativity emerges. Like ideas I could never have thought of myself just emerge from a collective group. And then that creativity, a lot of the things that emerge from our group just sort of foster and improve our cooperation with each other. And so there's sort of an infinity loop here. And we've provided legal support to 1,700 grassroots groups, and whether they call themselves cooperatives or not, they come sort of to us in the spirit of cooperation and creating better communities. So these are some of the groups we tend to work with. So we've gotten a window into other cooperatives, which has given us a sense of kind of what works, what doesn't, what tends to cause groups to unravel from within. And so that's what is guiding a lot of the tools that we've developed and that I'm going to share today. And if you'd like to learn more about what we do at the Law Center, it's a lot of things. And that's part of the product of being a cooperative group. And there's we have 19 staff, actually 20 as of this week. And people have a lot of autonomy as themselves and as small groups within our organization to devise and initiate projects in response to the needs they see in communities. And so what ends up happening is we're sort of like a small city where a lot of things happen. And these diverse and creative projects that we have are the product of being a cooperative. And so we have a gallery, it's a whole slideshow that you can click on if you want to learn about other areas that we work on. Okay, so I'm going to just dive in here. I use a lot of visuals and just a little bit of starting to build a little bit of a glossary of visual terms. I like to use squares a lot to represent business as usual, competition, dominance. And then I like to use sort of softer edge things with lots of arms to represent cooperatives and interdependence and the commons. And these are all like a whole bunch of words that are always sort of in motion. I use some of them interchangeably. But yeah, that's what you will see. And I can't teach anybody how to form cooperatives. Like there is no formula. What I can say is just the most transformative groups are the ones that are not fitting into any of the usual boxes. I would say a lot of cooperatives sort of early now in the cooperatives movement are tending to still reproduce a lot of the same boxes of business as usual. And so, you know, there's a lot of cooperatives out there that may or may not be a good model for things that people want to do if you're really trying to be transformative. And yeah, business as usual doesn't make us feel good. It's what got us into the present messes. So really, there's really no way I can tell you what it is we're going to do here because so much of it is yet to be created. So cooperatives is part of the theme of this presentation. I have to acknowledge that the word cooperatives, it's used in a lot of different ways, and depending on who's using it, whether they're a lawyer or a tax person or a cooperative movement builder, tend to view it as something different. And some people are like purists in how they define what a cooperative is. Other people just talk about it as sort of a spirit and culture of an organization. So I want to acknowledge I don't really have a definition, but I do have some kind of patterns that I've seen across different kinds of organizations that really kind of give a cooperative its like meaningful flavor. And I'm going to share what those ingredients are. But really, like in the solidarity economy, we're just seeing infinitely diverse organisms emerging. And I decided to give this presentation outside just because it's, you know, a nice vibe sitting under a tree, but also there's noise, so I might have to move. But yeah, what I would say is like, I feel like a lot of people, when they come to us, they're not asking us to tell them how to do something. In many ways, they sort of have their intuition about how to do something, how to work together. But, you know, within the system that we're operating in, we need to create the protective spaces, the protective shells in which they can do that. That's why there's a sea urchin here, the sort of soft insides with a protective shell around it. That's how we see our role as lawyers supporting cooperatives. And yeah, so Toolbox is part of this presentation. And one thing I wanted to say about tools is just like over time, I've shifted my thinking and just like, what's my role as a lawyer or an educator about cooperatives? It's not like I'm taking knowledge that I've accumulated and transplanting it into the minds of others. I've come to see like it really like what we need to do here is tap into our sort of intuitive inborn instincts for cooperating with each other and providing for each other. And it's like basically trying to create the conditions where we can all access the wisdom that's already in us. And I want to say I have not always been a goody two shoes and this like positive about humans and human nature and everything, but it's just like over time, it's kind of like a reality that I'm seeing. And one of the things I'm like, how do I know that this wisdom is already in us? And I'm like, this is the stuff we knew even before we were born, is that we are inseparable parts of larger organisms. It doesn't change after we're born. Like that is how we survive and thrive as humans. And cooperatives are kind of rebuilding and re-embracing really that reality of how we live. And so cooperatives to me also just feel like the most natural way to be. They're not odd outliers in the economy. They're just sort of us getting back to what we know and do best. And if you just look at, indigenous communities all over the world and throughout time, people intuitively know how to cooperate and take care of each other. And I'm going to use the octopus a little bit, but it's like an octopus is kind of like a cooperative in that it's kind of like 9 organisms within one. Different parts of it have autonomy, yet it is a single organism with interdependence on all parts. And, there's just an intuitive caring for the organism as a whole. Do we have law? What's with all this law stuff if all of this stuff is like already wisdom within us? Somewhere along the way, some stuff started to go wrong in the world, where we started to enable, some people to accumulate more assets than others. Other people over here needed protection from that. Like there began to be a lot of imbalances in society. And so society made a whole bunch of law. Like we're just like swimming in law everywhere. And a lot of that law is just, it sort of came to fill that space where love had been sort of people's intuitive caring instincts had been the decider of things. Like law kind of came in and had to like put something else in place. And yes, I am a lawyer. I went to law school. I've been swimming in this law stuff. And you probably didn't expect me to talk about love so much, but this is the thing, like I can't ignore it that, we can build all the most creative legal structures and legal protections in the world, but honestly, the thing that feels right is the thing that works best. And so that's why you sort of, as humans moving forward together, are going to be in the best position to, figure out how to structure things. I'm saying all this is a way of saying that a lot of what I'm about to say doesn't matter. Like really to empower people to not worry too much about the law and structure and what's the right way to do things, but really trust your instincts. And I think we're also in a really special time right now, just having been doing this work for 14 years myself, is something is shifting and really so many of the groups coming together and doing things right now. Just there's something that feels right about it. And what I'm noticing is trends across groups, and this speaks to some of the core ingredients I'm going to talk about later, is seeing that a lot of groups are just naturally forming non-hierarchical collectives. Like it's not even an intellectual decision. It's just sort of a natural, like, yeah, that's how we work together. They're not insular groups doing things. They tend to be nested in larger movements for transformation. And they're creating organizations and projects that are designed to be like for permanent community control, and not like assets that they're later going to sell out and cash in on. So it's like there's a lot of groups that share these things in common. And yeah, this is my role as a lawyer is, I really feel like this is like the legal documents that I create people. It really is kind of a cross between a legal document and a love letter, because legal documents are the things that are documenting the relationships that we're building with each other. A lot of the stuff in this slideshow is pieces of legal documents that you can use. But also there's no like clear path of how to do things, like how to form a cooperative step by step. Just in our experience and my observation, you know, the path, the path goes all over the place. And sometimes it's not even a path. It's just sort of a convergence of things that come together and make stuff happen. But yeah, bring friends, you will find your way. There's just so many beautiful stories of things emerging through collaboration. And one other reason I'm excited to be hanging out with arts and culture workers today is just that I do feel like artists, you know, I think about what is the role of artists in society? Like, I do feel like artists stand closest to the doors to our collective liberation. And that really like artists are, and not lawyers, are the ones who should be designing cooperatives. Like no one should have put this in the hands of lawyers, but lawyers have been, you know, leading a lot of the, I guess, building a lot of the narrative around what cooperatives are and how they should be. But yes, it should not be lawyers. All right, so I promised cake in the description. So we're gonna go into some cake now. And here's why I'm going into cake. So this is some of the technical stuff, which is just that y'all have probably heard all these fancy words like cooperative and B Corp and LLC. And, you know, people will come to me and say stuff like, you know, we want to form a cooperative, but someone said we should do a B Corp, but then another person said we should do a C Corp, but we kind of want to keep it simple and do an LLC. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, there's just a lot of things floating around here. I want to help people parse them out. So cake, this is how I turn to cake. There's entities that we form in our states, all across all 50 states. You can choose and establish entities. I think of that as the cake, you know, the spongy part of the cake. And then tax status is something you layer on top of that you choose at the federal level. So it's kind of like the icing you choose for certain benefits. But really, honestly, what makes a cake good? It's the ingredients. It's like the financial, governance, operations, policy, culture stuff. So I'm really going to focus on ingredients today, but give a little bit of overview. And we could, if you want, dive deeper into the entity and tax stuff. But yeah, like when people and lawyers have a very bad habit of smashing up the cake and handing it to a client and really not parsing these things out. So like one thing I want to say is like B Corp is not a type of corporation. It's a certification that an organization called B Labs will give you if you meet certain social benefit criteria. C Corp is not a type of corporation. It's a tax code status. So I don't know. Yeah, that's just why it's important to parse things out. So like I said, the cake, you choose that at the state level. The icing is federal, tax status. In the cake department, there's 3 general categories of cake. There's cakes that are designed kind of for outward benefit, to benefit the public. There's cakes that are more about shareholder benefit and that allow for profit. And then there's mutual benefit, which is, you know, cooperatives and things that tend to be designed for like a group of people to benefit themselves. The separation of these things is sort of a social construct, honestly. Like we don't need to separate these things, but this is how our legal system has done it. And I highlighted in blue what are the most common entities that our organization works with. You know, the 1,700 groups we've worked with. Most of them fall into one of these 4 blue categories. But yeah, really briefly, I'm going to just talk about like a little bit more about the cake. Like one kind of cake is sole proprietor. That's kind of like what happens as soon as you start putting yourself out there to do business in the world. It's kind of automatic. It's like poof, you become a sole proprietor. In the same way, if you and somebody else form a venture together, as soon as you start doing business together, it's kind of like poof, you've automatically created a partnership. So it's very easy to create a partnership. And then LLCs are kind of like partnerships, but with this kind of nice layer of liability protection, which may or may not be important to people. Compared to partnerships, that's the main difference, is that protection of liability. Compared to corporations, LLCs tend to be simpler, easier to form, easier to dissolve. And one nice thing about them is if you are a managing owner of one, often you don't have to treat yourself like an employee, because compliance with employment law tends to, it's a lot of administrative work. And then the fourth thing is corporations. And then there's corporations of various types. But the idea of corporations is you're kind of creating a thing separate from the individuals involved. And that could be a cooperative corporation, a nonprofit, a general, like typical stock corporation. So those are kind of like the four major categories of entity that you can choose. And a lot of people are attracted to this concept of limited liability. So I just wanted to talk about it for a second and say that limited liability doesn't mean that your cooperative or your enterprise is not going to get sued or be liable for things. For that, you want insurance because yes, cooperative can always get sued, but the liability shield is about protecting the individuals involved from things the enterprise does or things the other individuals do. So corporations and anything with an LL in it, like an LLC, tend to provide that shield. And yeah, it protects individuals from debts that the enterprise owes or harm that it causes. And yeah, because it's like the idea is like it's the company that causes the liability or owes the debt, not the individuals involved. The UPS truck is here. Okay. Anyways, but limited liability, I like to bring this up and I'm dwelling on it for the moment just because I really think people overplay its importance and over focus on it, because honestly, as individuals involved in a collective enterprise, you are still liable for any debts that you guarantee or your own negligence. And so the limited liability may not be that important. Other considerations when you're choosing an entity, and I don't know what other states are. I know California is one of the most expensive, but forming anything with limited liability comes with an 800 per year, like minimum tax. It's sort of the price you pay for that limited liability. Other considerations in choosing your cake or entity could have to do with like how much of a tolerance do you have for lots of administrative formalities? Corporations tend to have a lot more formalities overall than other kinds of entities. One of the biggest deciders of entity choice, honestly, tends to be whether you want to treat yourselves as employees, especially if you're a small collective group. Most small collective groups don't want to have to treat themselves as employees because it's a lot to set up. And sometimes there's not enough money to even be able to pay people initially at the outset of an enterprise. So LLCs and partnerships where people are managing it together tend to be able to avoid treating themselves as employees. So that's like one of the biggest deciders. Yeah, also just sort of looking at sort of this binary between public benefit and then mutual benefit, these two kinds of cakes. Like I said, it's a little bit of a false binary because honestly, our sweet spot and that of most of our clients is something that really combines the two, where it might be democratic nonprofit organizations that are enabling, they're benefiting communities, but also enabling community self-determination. So it's kind of like a chocolate cake with a lot of vanilla swirls mixed in. It's a public benefit organization, but with cooperative flavoring. Alternatively, there's like a lot of cooperatives. They're not just insular groups providing for their members. They're also engaging in systems change work and movement building so that they have an outward benefit. So whether you still have to choose one cake or the other, that's part of what our legal system forces us to do, but then it's the ingredients that I'm about to talk about that really give it the flavor. And also you can choose any of these other sort of conventional for-profit entities like LLCs, and then just bake in those ingredients that make it sort of public benefit or mutual benefit, again, through the ingredients. But rather than go into a ton of detail, but I can if you want me to later, about all these entities and tax statuses, I'm going to just give you, like, after 14 years of working with a whole bunch of groups, what I tend to see happen is small worker collectives tend to land on forming partnerships or LLCs. And a lot of that's because they want to avoid the employment law piece. And they tend to default to being taxed as partnerships, pass-through taxation, which means the income gets allocated to all of the individuals involved. There's not like a separate entity holding the assets apart from the individuals. So this is not always the case. There are small worker cooperatives that are structured as cooperative corporations. But overall, this is where I tend to see small worker collectives going. Larger cooperatives, though, tend to form corporations, either nonprofit corporations or cooperative corporations. And that choice, and they tend to, if they're a nonprofit, they tend to be 501c3. There are various other 501cs you can choose, but 501c3 has a lot of benefits. Or if they're cooperative, they get taxed under subchapter T, which is the special tax code for cooperatives, which has a lot of benefits to it. But that decision actually for so many groups I've worked with is like, that's the pivotal decision right there, is cooperative or 501c3. And so many groups fall right on that line. And if any of you is right on that line, you could be, feel free to bring that up and we can chat about it. To just sort of look at some of the nuances of who decides to fall where. But really, best case scenario is that nonprofits and co-ops will always exist in the solidarity economy and collaborate a lot with each other, so everyone can get the best of all worlds.
Janelle, a real quick clarification question.
Yeah.
If people want to know, what's the general threshold between quote small or quote large?
I have this number 12 in my head. Because a lot of times people say 12 is sort of the maximum of like what can feel, what is it, kind of like a small cooperative group, that any group that's larger starts to feel, people can start to feel distant from each other. And so for a small collective where everyone's meaningfully managing it together, I tend to say 12 might be the max, but it's very, very fluid. Yeah, larger cooperatives, anything larger than that. And I have a feeling also based on seeing who registered that there are some of you who are looking to form small worker collectives, and others of you, kind of like Austin, who gave the last webinar about Ample, that cooperative, they could be becoming a very large cooperative. And could be serving hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of members. And there's definitely a lot of differences between a small worker collective and a large cooperative serving 10,000 independent artists, but still there's a lot of commonalities. So I'm going to talk about those three ingredients.
Just one more question, maybe, since you're on before you switch topics, from Jennifer. Can an LLC be fiscally sponsored by a nonprofit if they are operating with socially beneficial model?
I have some slides. All the formatting came out weird, but they're very near the end of this slideshow about models of fiscal sponsorship. But the short answer is yes. An LLC can't come under the umbrella of a nonprofit, but a nonprofit can contract with an LLC to bring in funding that it then provides to the LLC in exchange for the LLC doing like good work in the world, advancing the nonprofit's charitable purposes. And we do this at the Law Center. So if it's something people are interested in, I'm happy to talk about it. We are a nonprofit 501c3. We've brought in probably $1.5 million that we've channeled outward to cooperatives being not 501c3s. And we're actually trying to encourage more 501c3s to do that because a lot of them are intimidated by it. All right. So, like I said, the entity stuff, the tax stuff, it doesn't matter too much. It's these ingredients that matter. And so over the years, we've tried to come up with like, how do we boil down the ingredients? And we've landed for a pretty long time on these three that we describe as, does the entity spread power? Does it spread wealth? And does it deeply root that wealth and power in the community? So I'll give you examples of how to do that. And yeah, I've really come to see like the concentration of wealth and power as almost like addictions, and that like really cooperatives they're going to make us all happier because they're going to help us counteract these addictions to accumulation of power, accumulation of wealth. because we've sort of created this, we've spread this belief that like individuals are, we earn our respect, our self-worth by being high up in power structures or by accumulating lots of wealth on our own, that is the path to security. And of course, these two things like wealth and power, accumulation tend to reinforce each other. And, it's really gotten out of hand in the world. But cooperatives sort of bring heart back into the matter. And it's like, no, everyone deserves, respect and power. And everyone deserves, to be benefiting from the wealth the cooperative builds. Everyone deserves security. So yeah, cooperatives will save us. And yeah, ultimately what we're doing is through cooperatives, we're nesting ourselves in many webs of relationships that create belonging and nurturance that will provide for us. So yeah, many of the slides below are actual policies, you could say, policies, practices, guidelines that you as a cooperative, you can adapt them, adapt them to your own group. Slideshows are the format that we use now for that I use for almost all legal documents, and it's becoming more common among many of my coworkers too. And our clients just love it. It feels like something they can interact with more and digest more, sort of digest the legal document bite by bite. So you can literally take slides out of this and use them for your own purposes. So ingredient one, practices and tools to spread power. And I've phrased a lot of these in the we, as in like, if you wanted to adopt some of these as policies, you could just do that. But yeah, spreading power, part of that is just always like sort of creating a culture of always naming and actively working against the concentration of power in organizations. And power does not need to be evenly spread. The idea is that it should remain fluid and sort of go to where it's needed, put power in the hands of people who are in a position to make a positive impact. And in our organization, because I'm a founder, I'm also a lawyer, I'm white, what else? Educational privilege, all these things. There's a lot of ways in which, power just sort of falls on me in both intentional and unintentional ways. And we have lots of conversations about how is power maybe piling up in the hands of me or other people in the organization, and is that having positive or negative impacts, and are there ways that we can spread that power around? So we really have adopted a culture of talking about power, and also more specifically talking about dominance and oppression in our organization. What is the role of white supremacy and pushing power into the hands, particularly of white staff in our organization. So just having a culture of talking about it all the time. Creating many centers of power. So if you think about if you were to imagine yourself in a big, huge group of people, it's hard, sometimes it can be hard to imagine yourself as like having a voice or being able to actively move the group or, have power over things. But groups of people working in small groups, and this is where 12 is that number, but 3, 6, 8, people, those are the spaces where individuals really can feel their own power and things, have agency. And so particularly for larger organizations, creating many centers of power, aka polycentricity, in the organization is essential to spreading power. Enabling people, and this is again important in the larger groups, to sort of even have a way to create a new group or initiate a new project within the organization. So having a process that one person could say, hey, I want to start a new project, and bring a few people together and do that. It's good to like create an explicit process. Some work and power coming hand in hand is this sort of like a pattern that feels important, where even if you have let's say you have a large cooperative of 1,000 people, there could be artists who are, sharing access to some tools together, whatever it is, there's probably still going to be workers who work in the cooperative on a daily basis, like getting the work of the cooperative done. It's so important that whoever's doing the work has a lot of power in decision making, because the people doing the work are, in a sense, they're the ones sort of carrying out the desire of members. Their workers are the vehicle through which members express their power. So when workers have power, then members have power. If you have an organization that's very hierarchical, and a member comes to a worker and says, hey, I want to do this thing. And the worker has to go ask their boss's boss, things don't move. Members don't have direct accountability or can't express power by talking to workers. Self-direction combined with peer feedback. This is kind of how things work in our organization, is really each worker has a lot of power to decide when and how and what they do in the organization, but in constant dialogue with people around them. We have lots of small teams. We have peer-to-peer sort of peer review, performance review processes. Before we do things, we create a space where we invite coworkers to give feedback. And so it's self-direction, but it's not like we're each individual is out there deciding everything on our own. It's the constant feedback. So creating spaces in an organization where people can communicate with each other is really critical, particularly as groups get larger. Like information really needs to flow among people. Creating welcoming spaces, fostering belonging, helping everyone feel visible in a group. This is where a lot of culture comes in. It's like even the check-in questions at the beginning of meetings can feel so valuable in helping people feel like they are a part of a group and therefore able to express power within that group. There's all kinds of space for creativity there. Another piece on spreading power is, in many cases, not all cases, but where a lot of the work gets done, probably having clear meeting processes, so that people have a clear sense of where they can plug in. They can prepare in advance. In a lot of organizations, sometimes I've gone to meetings of other organizations and I'll see like one person dominate the entire meeting. And a lot of times it's because there's not really a clear process. People don't know where they can speak up. Participating and building agendas. Whoever builds a meeting agenda has a lot of power. So enabling multiple people to contribute and add to an agenda in advance of a meeting really does change how things unfold. Meeting facilitation, also very important for fostering participation and inclusivity. And one thing is, we've learned that really anyone can be a facilitator. There's certain facilitation skills that are great to cultivate, and I kind of feel as a facilitator myself, like I feel like I'm always building my skills. But we try to also rotate facilitation so that everyone builds those skills, and they're facilitators also do hold some of the power in a meeting. So deliberating on decisions, I try to boil that down to, it's not just that someone says, hey, let's do this, and then you vote on it. Deliberating means that you create a space where people can give feedback and a space where you can incorporate feedback. So you propose something but then you massage it. And as a group, you're sort of collectively massaging it. So that proposals get reshaped based on the collective wisdom. This is one that's felt really important to our group, which is, some people describe this as the difference between consensus and consent. And cooperatives, sometimes people think, oh, do cooperatives have to operate by consensus, where everyone has to feel like, really good about the outcome of a decision? Consent is where everyone is sort of just says, hey, it's good enough. It's safe to try. You make a decision, even if not everybody loves it. And the idea is that, like, to really embrace, diversity and a plurality of views, and to support experimentation, it's important to let people propose things that other people may not like, but that if they don't have any kind of like really big objection to it, they're content to stand aside and say, yeah, that's safe to try. Let's do it. We'll see how it goes. Conflict. I'm learning more and more over time that conflict really is like, even just like tiny tensions, everything from tiny tensions to big blowouts. that is where so many good things in life emerge from, because it is in response to those tensions that we tend to improve upon things or deepen relationships, deepen trust. So conflict, yay. And having really robust, processes for engaging with that conflict, it's so important. At our organization, we do a lot of trainings to just always improve upon our skills of engaging in conflict or communicating with each other. That includes a lot of like anti-oppression training, because it's all sort of woven in together. So yeah, conflict, yay. Building skills. So one way that power tends to concentrate in organizations is that certain people have skills or knowledge that allow them to do certain work, and connected to that work is a lot of power. And so in order to spread power, you need to spread different kinds of work around and sort of let different people hold it at different times. And that means building skills. We are a bunch of lawyers in my organization and non-lawyers, but several of our non-lawyer staff have become, or they're becoming lawyers without going to law school, just by apprenticing within our workplace. Another thing that's really helpful, and again, all of these are patterns that we've seen across a lot of organizations, including our own, but many others that seem to help groups spread power. These are not all things that everyone needs to adopt, but they are things you can adopt because they can be very helpful in spreading power. But we also, in our organization, nobody has a defined role or job description. What we have is we each sort of have a collection of roles, and we hand them off to each other from time to time. And so, yeah, contact management, honestly, I think that's a role in our organization. No one really cares to do all that much. And so one coworker just went on leave and passed it off to another coworker. And being able to pass roles around is also so important in preventing the stagnation and concentration of power. Yeah. And I guess I already touched a little bit on communication. This might be a little bit repetitive. But yeah, just lots of internal communication, particularly in the workplace. Lots of transparency about what's going on. It's really important. Oh yeah, I mentioned we sort of all have a sort of a collection of different roles. Certain roles in our organization, we either rotate them or we randomly assign them. We use pickerwheel.com to sort of spin a wheel and just randomly assign people to certain roles from time to time. Because a lot of times people don't feel empowered to or confident, I guess, to step up and take on roles, or sometimes, yeah, there are roles that kind of no one really wants. And, so moving them randomly is or in a rotating way can be really helpful. And like overall, if you're in an organization and like if you're going to form a cooperative, you really want dense participation. That's where the magic of cooperatives emerges, is from lots of people cooperating and shaping it. And a lot of cooperatives suffer from kind of languishing participation, where it'll just be like a core group of people that tends to decide everything, and other people are kind of like, nah, they don't want to be involved anymore. And so just like if that starts to be the case, it's like there's a lot of self-reflection, a lot of learning from other organizations about what works well, gathering feedback from members, and just continuing to try new things, doing outreach, more engagement. Like it should be a constant process of just trying to find ways to engage dense participation. So with larger cooperatives, engaging lots of different stakeholders can be done by actually building in different, multiple member categories into the same organization. So I created sort of a fake cooperative with 4 member or owner categories. I use those words interchangeably. But it could be a large scale cooperative designed to serve artists, and you could have, hundreds, thousands of members who might have different interests and do different things with the cooperative than people who, the cooperative could also create jobs for artists who, if you're relying on the cooperative for your actual, livelihood, you have a different relationship to the cooperative. So that might be a different stakeholder group. There could be an ownership category for people who kind of steward the backbone of the cooperative. They may not be artists, but they might be like the accountant and, you know, other kind of operational staff. And then lastly, and you know, you could probably think of other member categories. This is just my hypothetical one, is you could have a category of member owner that's like people who are patrons of the artists, or just like broader members of the community who want to support this cooperative and be part of it in some way, or enjoy some of the benefits of it. And you know, some of these member groups could be much larger than others. Some of them could be overlapping. And these are the kinds of slides that I create for and with clients when they're trying to figure out who's going to be part of their cooperative, to just sort of visualize how things work and who's involved. And then even if you have like multiple categories of owners, they may not have equal status to each other. Some might be the real focal point of the benefit of the cooperative. Like in this case, the artists might be the primary beneficiaries and therefore hold more of the power within the cooperative. But these other stakeholder groups are important too. They just might not have as much of the power benefits flowing to them. And then, yeah, there's a lot of stakeholders that are harder to represent because they can't become members, such as future generations, non-human beings, and cooperatives, organizations can designate roles, board seats to represent those stakeholders. So cooperatives, by the way, one of the core elements of them people talk about is like one member, one vote. They're democratic, you know, it's democratic control, which is important, although it is like one of the last things I'm coming to in the slides, because honestly, having been involved in a whole bunch of co-ops, voting is not the way that people really express themselves, express their agency, and express their power on a day-to-day basis. Voting, though, can be and is in many cases really important, because particularly if a cooperative is drifting away from its purpose, or it's not engaging people through those other, you know, spaces of power, then voting is a way that members can organize themselves and really shift the direction of things, either by electing or removing board members or proposing new structures. So at the end of the day, the democratic control can be really powerful. And by the way, not all things need boards of directors. Corporations, this kind of archaic law that we're stuck with, corporations have to have boards of directors and operate, quote unquote, under the ultimate authority of the board. So the selection of the board is important, but we've helped a lot of co-ops reconceive the role of the board, not as a group that holds power, but as a group whose primary role is to spread power, to really sort of oversee a decentralized, inclusive, participatory governance structure. And so you have to have a board, but if you're going to have a board, you know, some of the important pieces are that they be representative of the member owners of the organization, that they be primarily in an oversight role and helping to ensure decentralized governance. And you could have most or all of those be elected, but a lot of co-ops we work with like to have certain board seats be appointed by nonprofits or other like movement organizations that will help sort of anchor the cooperative accountability to larger social change movements. So that was all about power. I'm going to talk about spreading wealth and then how to keep that wealth and power rooted. I will say power was, you know, that's the longer piece. To me, it's the most important thing, because when you spread power, you're spreading the control of wealth. Like wealth will flow naturally when you spread power. That said, there's some good stuff that you can do to help spread wealth. And one thing about wealth is, I don't know, wealth, sometimes, you know, you just think of gold coins and dollars. I like this word nourishment or nurturance. I don't know, nourishment. Like, what is it about at the end of the day? It's about us being provided for and feeling secure. And so really it's about nourishment, and really wealth, and the wealth that we can create collectively with each other. It's infinite, just like there's infinite ways we can provide for each other. So yes, wealth is infinite. It's not just money. So thinking beyond that framework for wealth. So back to the octopus. I think about the octopus all the time, and I think of it as a metaphor for the collectives that we form. Because like I said, like an octopus is kind of like 9 beings all in one. And so each of, its arms has autonomy to make some decisions and do what it wants in response to its environment. But it's a being with collective intelligence. And so it's not like one arm of the octopus is going to be over here languishing while the rest of them are strong. Like, it sends nourishment and energy kind of naturally to where it needs to go. And I think, a collective group that is like really healthy and thriving, like wealth will be determined, the flow of that wealth will be determined by collective intelligence. And it's, another way of saying it is just sort of when we're connected to each other, it's almost like when you're connected to someone, them, it's like affection and care emerges naturally. And when we feel connected to others, we naturally nurture them and nourish them because they are us. This is the power of small collectives. This is like, I feel like small collectives are where all the magic in the world will happen, is because as small collective groups, we naturally nurture each other and let the wealth flow. The other reason I like using octopuses is that there's so much harm and there's so much inequity that we're already sort of sitting with right now that needs to be repaired. And, an octopus has the ability to repair itself and repair arms that are broken off. And we sort of, we have that ability as collective groups to sort of see that our strength as a group, we are collectively stronger and wealthier when every member of us is strong. And so we channel resources to where they are needed, to where repair is needed, which takes reparations out of this frame of like charity. It's not like we are giving to someone else. It's like we are giving to ourselves. When we're truly part of collective groups, repair is a thing that will flow more naturally and intuitively. And all of this requires not math, not like formulas for the division of proceeds or surpluses. Like when a cooperative builds wealth and has like surpluses of that wealth, then the decisions about where to channel that really should be adaptive and responsive to actual needs within the cooperative, not like static mathematical formulas. So really tapping into our collective intelligence. And I know this is sort of all talking in the abstract a bit, but I'll just share a few other principles, and hopefully this is helpful in thinking through a little bit of just like the structuring of like even financial flows within an organization. One of the most important things to cooperatives and to our kind of sovereignty in like within cooperatives and how we decide things is we really need to break up with the cult of the market and this concept of fair market value. Like the market does not determine our value. We do as collective groups. And so like a lot of groups, I'll hear them fall back on, well, I have this college degree or I have this skill or background, so I deserve this because, in the market, I could be earning this much. And that's not what determines our value. And it also doesn't determine what we need. And so like, we really need to, anytime people, like when you hear people falling back on what does the market tell me I deserve, I think people should feel free to question that. And it comes up a lot in our organizations. But structurally, ways to help spread wealth, one of those ways is to actually put limits on its accumulation, where there are various ways that people can extract wealth from an organization. One is through excessive compensation of like executives or other workers, or on like underpaying certain people, paying people non-living wages. Another way is like excessive return on capital. I'm even, trying to question more whether any capital or money investment should generate more money. Like maybe all capital should be no cost. But putting caps on, a lot of organizations will put a 5% cap on return on investment or 15% cap, which is built into the California cooperative law. And yeah, excessive profit from the use or sale of assets. We work with a lot of real estate groups, but yeah, it's like putting a cap on what any like member can get if they sell, say, their share of a housing cooperative. So caps are really important because once you cap extraction, then the wealth will still accumulate, but it's got to go somewhere. And it's like, then it's the group's the decision about where it goes. And I just threw in an example you can come back to. East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is a client of ours, and we created cartoon bylaws for them. But yeah, they've put a sort of a floor and a ceiling on what their investors can earn. Same with floor and ceiling for their worker compensation, and also for what their residents can get, residents of their housing can get as financial benefits. So thanks for that, Allison. Okay, one other thing about actually, I have a few unfinished slides here, but I'm going to just do my best to talk through them. But yeah, just if an organization is really prioritizing the building of collective wealth over individual accumulations, so like our path to economic stability is by building collective wealth, where wealth will flow among people and to where it's needed when it's needed, as opposed to letting each individual accumulate like this giant nest egg. It changes the logic of how an organization works. So like if you're trying to create collective wealth, then the logic kind of gets turned inside out, where our individual well-being becomes really like best supported by building collective well-being. Then we're no longer like these rational individual actors who are calculating and making decisions based on getting as much as we can. It shifts us into a mindset where we're relational actors, where we're kind of like intuitively making decisions together to give as much as we can. And I've really seen this like take hold in meaningful ways, where yeah, people can just be so generous, and the price they pay for things or that they ask for things has very little to do with them getting as much as they can, but really wanting to build collective well-being. And when you can activate that logic in people, it's magical. For spreading wealth, there's sort of like this also a balance in a cooperative of stability and mobility, of where, you know, people, particularly if they're depending on a cooperative for their housing or their jobs, like wanting to feel like this is a stable place, but also wanting to know that they're going to be supported if they leave. And I didn't get a chance to build slides on this, but this, I don't know, there's probably a lot to say about that. And can be a challenging balance. But one other piece about spreading, oh yeah, this one other slide unfinished, decoupling giving and getting. I guess the ultimate message here is that the value of things really is unmeasurable. The wealth that we're creating together is so diverse, and it can't really be measured, especially not in dollars. And so when people are contributing to a collective enterprise, trying to calculate that they should get something of equal quote unquote value in return, it's kind of impossible. So when you decouple giving and getting, a lot of the decisions get made based on like, what can a person give? And then what does a person need? So just sort of shifting how the decisions get made and making it less about calculation and just like equal math. And yeah, I think the cooperatives that are most powerful to me are the ones that they're not just an insular group of people benefiting their members as patrons, which is, like I said, it's kind of how a lot of cooperatives have taken shape, but but really like the most powerful ones are serving their members as in their role as larger movement builders, seeing the cooperative's role sort of an outward orientation toward broader system transformation. That's an important piece to build in. And then just one last piece, because I wanted to stop talking and shift to discussion pretty soon. This is the third ingredient. Okay, it's like we've built wealth, or sorry, we're spreading power, we're spreading wealth. And now what we've built, like how do we make sure that that stays rooted? And in our community. And because this is the thing that happens is it's like sort of the default is you create anything of value in the society. The default is this notion that we should be able to sell it to the highest bidder. And we lose so many things in that way. And of course, the highest bidders, they're becoming this very powerful few who control a lot of the wealth. And like this idea that the highest bidder should get anything is just, it's insidious. So collectives, this is why collectivizing is essential, because the thing that will protect the assets the most are people having sort of an affectionate, intuitively or sort of intrinsically motivated desire to, in the long term, protect and be part of these assets that we're building. And one kind of comparison that's really helped me is nearly every country bans the sale of organs. Like this is just intuitive to a lot of people. You shouldn't be like able to sell your kidney, because otherwise people who are financially destitute might be coerced into selling their organs. And so this idea is repulsive to people. That's why most countries outlaw it. But really, like cooperatives and other organizations are like, these are the organs, these are like the lungs and this is like the organs of communities. We should not be able to sell them, like they're essential to human life. And so hopefully it becomes more and more repulsive to us, this idea that we can sell any of these assets. But meanwhile, there are legal things we can do to build in restraints against selling assets. And it's kind of important in some cases, particularly if there's already something of value that's sort of collectively held or created, like real estate. Is it's important to put these restraints in place from the beginning, because if you try to do it later, sometimes it's like trying to stuff toothpaste back into the tube. It's like a group of people get some land and they're like, oh, this is now worth $5 million. Like it's sometimes mentally hard to put that profit paste back into the toothpaste tube. And remember, no, the land is the thing of value. It's not the $5 million that we can sell to the highest bidder. So as you're starting something, and particularly once you're about to create or take title to some asset, putting some restraints on sale is important. We've done this. Another example of a co-op we've worked with is People Power Solar Cooperative. And this is literally a picture out of their bylaws. I can't believe I get away with putting ridiculous things in bylaws, but I do. But yeah, it's like, well, what if People Power does create something of value? Like, and then Tesla comes along and says, hey, we'll buy this for $1 billion. We need to have the decision-making structure in place to prevent that. Imagine that the cooperative has become kind of insular and there's maybe just a small group of members that's deciding things. Like, we don't want them to be able to decide to sell out this community asset. So where the nay comes in is that there's designated people in the bylaws who would have to approve certain major changes to bylaws, including like the sale of the cooperative or its assets. So we build these things into the legal documents to prevent sale. But yeah, another thing, like what also helps keep the power and wealth rooted is like, think about what are the things that could start to unravel an organization from within. And a lot of it is sort of like rewind back to all those slides that I created about power. But yeah, a lot of co-ops, they do sort of blow apart in interpersonal conflict, or they do end up becoming overly reliant on maybe like one charismatic individual or one highly knowledgeable individual. And these are things that could unravel a cooperative pretty quickly. So this internal resilience is like you really want to like spread skill and knowledge throughout the cooperative, like have really robust processes for navigating interpersonal conflict. Like there's a lot, and it's like, it's not just important to your health as like individuals being part of the cooperative, but to the community as a whole, to the extent that these co-ops are assets of the community. And then one last thing is external resilience. And the reality is a lot of cooperatives are going to come and go, and their assets probably will be transferred on. Things in nature come and go all the time. So it's natural that some co-ops will die, but building kind of a network, an ecosystem of relationships that basically makes sure that helps protect the co-ops in the long term, but also help to protect whatever their assets are. Assets could be a worker who has a lot of skills, might move from that co-op to another co-op or organization that it has a relationship with. So the asset is not lost. A piece of real estate. So East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, a lot of its real estate, they're taking title or helping manage it in relation to other organizations that will co-steward it. And maybe if the cooperative ever fizzles out, could take title to that land. So there's building this external network, sort of nesting it in relationships that will protect the assets in the long term. And within the bylaws of that cooperative, lots of provisions that make sure that if land does get transferred, that it be transferred to similar organizations, not just sold on the market. If the cooperative does close down, that its assets go to other similar organizations. The cooperative is also anchored to a handful of local organizations to make sure that its mission remains accountable to them and that its work remains accountable to them. They have 3 directors appointed by local nonprofits. And so, yeah, a lot of what I do also as a lawyer is just I help build these webs of relationships, or it's not that I build the relationships, but I help secure them, because people create these relationships naturally. But then it's important, because these are so valuable, to create legally binding structures to secure those relationships. So that's where those lawyers come in. But ultimately, it's not the legal relationships that matter, it's love, which is why I took time to draw all these little hearts. And yeah, big picture, all of our work just needs to be embedded in, accountable to larger coalitions and movements. That's what's going to make us all resilient in the long term and keep these assets rooted. And I created some fun slides here you can come back to. I'm also going to just show you real quick. This slideshow is long. So long, I just froze my computer. But yeah, you'll see over here on the side, I just created some fun slides that depict like a year in the life of a co-op member. I have a whole bunch of slides on sort of like, what are the benefits of forming a cooperative corporation? What are some like misconceptions about cooperatives? So there's a whole section just about co-ops. Got a little section on partnerships and LLCs. Wait, where are the, oh yeah. Here's a section that goes deeper into nonprofit structures and things like 501c4s, 501c3, like what are the benefits and misconceptions related to 501c3s. That's all here. And oh, this is a fun one. I created a simple agreement. It's an operating agreement or a partnership agreement for what can be a small worker collective, a cooperatively structured LLC or partnership. Kind of put the bare bones of what would be needed in such an agreement in these slides. And I know a handful of cooperatives that have actually adopted this, or not adopted this, but used it as the basis for their own agreements. Because this is like one of the things is like a lot of groups just get hung up trying to find a lawyer, get a lawyer to understand them, get a lawyer to draft their documents. And it's probably good to have a lawyer to review it, but you really can do a lot of this yourself. So this is like, these are actual tools you can come back and take a look at and maybe even use. I go way deep into tax categories for like co-ops and other entities that do pay tax, all the different mixing and matching of cake and icing and what it all means. I will only go into that if people really want to learn about it today. These are slides just about how 501c3s are starting to really diversify what they do, and kind of the legal boundaries of 501c3 law are shifting. And so I go into that more deeply as a way of saying that 501c3s can be a container for more than you think, and that a lot of cooperative community self-determination activity can happen within 501c3s. So don't throw 501c3 babies out with the bathwater just because nonprofit industrial complex makes you crazy. there's a lot of benefits to being a 501c3, and you can still mostly function like a cooperative under a 501c3. And what else is here? These are some slides where the format got messed up. I didn't get a chance to fix it, but yeah, fiscal sponsorship is a way a lot of groups get up and running. I know probably a lot of arts groups are fiscally sponsored by larger organizations, and there's different models of that. And but what is not less, or what's less common in the realm of fiscal sponsorship, is enabling democratic groups, cooperative groups, under a fiscal sponsorship umbrella. So there is, in the resources near the top, a link to a video where I talk through these slides. And so that's my roadmap to this toolbox. And I will happily go into more detail, but I'm just going to stop and let people unmute themselves and just share what's on your mind. Like, what are you chewing on? Or what questions did this leave you with? And maybe we can collect a bunch of them. Like, I won't respond immediately to everything people ask. You can, let's say, sorry, how about you type stuff in and unmute yourself, and we'll just sort of take up a collection. And like I said, this is a DIY, take your own break kind of a thing. So feel free to go off camera and take your break as needed. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and just try to see everybody.
Yeah, forming your comment or your question in the chat actually is really helpful too, because it helps to remind us, is it really a question or is it really a comment? So we can kind of do that sort of self-filtering before we share. So.
Nice, thanks. Oh, I see Dalton, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Janelle. Really appreciate all this info. I also just posted the question in the chat. I asked it last week in the other workshop, and it's around just the nuts and bolts. We're a national collective, and we don't have an EIN, a bank account, or an address, but we want all of that so that we can get funding and stop using PayPal Pool. And what we just keep running up against is one person's social security number or address, and whether to do that in California or New York. So I'd love any help in that, or we can broaden it, of course, with other questions. Thanks.
Nice. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Yeah, feel free to keep typing it in.
Super appreciate that question, Dalton. And I remember when you asked that last week. Thank you, Janelle. One of my roommates actually, I think, works with you, Robin Bean Crane. So grateful, just so grateful. I'm just always inspired by the Sustainable Economies Law Center. I guess I just wanted to speak in this space just to process out loud. I don't know if I have a fully formed question, but it is something that I've been thinking about. And so I am calling on behalf of Placeholder Magazine. We're an arts magazine based out of Stockton, California, which is one of the most marginalized and sort of oppressed regions in the Central Valley. And, you know, there's a lot going on here when it comes to, we kind of have a media desert and a sort of massive disinfo site that's pervading our community, as well as existing, challenges like, lack of economic opportunities specifically for artists and things like that. And, a question or sort of a thing that I'm meditating on is, at least with the resources that you shared, is what sort of ways have you been able to, at least I noticed that, one of the models that you proposed or was naming that folks could do a number of projects inside of a worker-owned cooperative, as long as it maybe is carried by the same vision and same mission. And what we're hoping to do is to stimulate the local arts economy and also bring forward socially conscious community advocacy and kind of merging those worlds. And I guess I'm wondering, I guess I'm wondering the same question because with Dalton, just because, I've been kind of holding the admin of everything. And, it seems like structures to establish businesses and things like that are always so individualist. And how do we work on that? And especially even too, when it comes to non-monetary resources as well. I've been meditating a lot about like, how do we create mechanisms for collective cars, or you know, like just like ownership of resources in general, like material resources. So I'm curious about that as well.
Great, thank you. I'm going to catch up on the ones in writing here. Welcome anyone else to speak up in the meantime.
I think maybe Orion's typed question and Samantha's typed question maybe are connected, if you're seeing those, Janelle.
Okay. Okay, so we have a fairly small inventory, unless people are holding back. Yeah. All right, let me think about where to dive in, sort of weaving some of these together. Yeah.
It seems to be a lot of questions around sort of entity structures, no?
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, where to dive in here? So, yeah, one thing that happened last year when COVID started changing our world is something like 1,200 mutual aid groups form, probably a whole lot more. You know, it's like mutual aid groups started forming everywhere. So many of them were just loose groups of individuals just trying to make resources flow to where they needed to go. A lot of times, a lot of those resources by necessity had to flow through someone's bank account. And so yeah, there's just like a lot of ad hoc movement of like activities and people and resources. But yeah, honestly, there does come a point where this question of like whether to formalize or not does become pretty pivotal. And it does require that a group kind of have one or more people who are willing to kind of sit down and do a little bit of the administrative work that would be needed for that. And so even while like all these groups were like just trying to get people's basic needs met and rent paid, they needed to find some kind of structure. And actually fiscal sponsorship last year with all these groups forming turned out to be really critical of a project being able to come under the umbrella of another organization, whether it was a 501c3 or a cooperative, just that any kind of established entity, you know, it's you know, articles of incorporations filed, it has limited liability for individuals, which might be nice, and it files tax returns, because this is like one of the major questions is who reports the movement of resources on their tax return. And so what we started to do is talk to a lot of other organizations, nonprofits, and co-ops to just be like, hey, could you be sort of the umbrella? Like, this is a group of people doing great things. Could you please be the umbrella for them so that they're not a bunch of individuals putting money in individual bank accounts and having to report that on taxes? And so this is more of a call to any established organization will be doing like a lot of good if they can be an umbrella for collective groups to sort of attach and let their resources flow through. But when you can't find a larger organization to attach to in that way, or for whatever reason you do want to retain your complete autonomy, then formalizing, then it does be this major question of, are you a cooperative or a 501c3? That pivotal question does become really important. And I could talk more about sort of the benefits of going the 501c3 route. but it is, the start, there's sort of a high barrier to threshold to starting, which is like a lot of paperwork, getting that recognition of tax exemption. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but let me just pause and catch up with the comments, and then maybe I can invite some clarifying pieces. I see there's some questions about relationships with LLCs, so I can try to come back to that.
I think Asta's question connects to Patricia's question about how nonprofits can be more cooperative structure.
Yeah. Truly, there's very little under nonprofit law that should keep a nonprofit from functioning like a cooperative if it wants to. Nonprofit corporations do need to have these boards of directors, but as I mentioned, like shifting the role of board of directors to one where the board is spreading power, not holding power, that you can do in a nonprofit. Our organization, we have 6 board members, and we call them owls because they're sort of providing careful oversight. Owls have good eyesight and hearing. That's why we use that. But yeah, their role is oversight, and then they spread the power largely to the workers in Sustainable Economies Law Center. But Sustainable Economies Law Center is also the umbrella to 6 other small organizations, and each of those have relative autonomy. And we have, I should find the link and just share it with you. We have some sample fiscal sponsorship agreements where like fiscal sponsorship really does, it creates like another organization within an organization, but most fiscal sponsors don't tend to understand or fully recognize that groups want to be structured democratically. So what we have is we've created fiscal sponsorship agreements that create small democratic groups that are largely autonomous, operating within our umbrella. And we have on our website about worker self-directed nonprofits, some of the other kinds of practices we've adopted to be sort of integrating the best practices of co-ops into nonprofits. Oh yeah, but I was going to say one other thing about nonprofits is under 501c3 law in particular, there's concern that, the nonprofit doesn't operate for the private benefit of individuals. Also that the activities aren't too commercial in nature or competing with commercial enterprises. But there's a lot that an organization can do to kind of create a space for like the best of both worlds, for cooperative enterprises to happen under 501c3s. And a lot of that is just by like carefully documenting and navigating conflicts of interest, or having the board make a resolution saying like it's in the best interest of the nonprofit and most effectively advances our charitable purpose to put certain decision making in the hands of cooperative groups within the organization. So it's a way to create self-determination in a sector that sort of has a reputation for concentrating power in the hands of boards and executive directors. I'm gonna take a moment to keep reading these because I feel like I'm rambling a little bit. I want to kind of rein myself in and try to figure out what's the most helpful thing, but also invite more conversation about it too. Like if anything I was just speaking to, if you feel like you can add something to that, please do.
Well, I'm just curious, and just to throw just a tiny comment into this is that it seems like there's a lot of questions about whether or not like hybrid models of LLCs and 501c3s can work and like in harmony. And it seems like a lot of people are interested in that. And I'm just curious if anyone here has any specific questions towards that, or if there's any context that could be shared about that, because I know that was like a juicy piece of conversation. I'm sorry, a juicy piece of.
I just want to add to that. I was one of the persons or people who asked about nonprofits working more cooperatively. And I think, thank you for your response, but I also think where I'm coming from is when it's not necessarily like wanted. Like when I'm a worker and we're trying to look for models that would be better based on our values and our mission, but it's not necessarily coming from the board or the executive director.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Okay, those are kind of two things I'll try to hold and address. But we started, and in fact, we fiscally sponsor it, something called the Nonprofit Democracy Network, which is now a network of at least 75 nonprofits across the US. And most of them are part of the network because they're committed as an organization toward moving toward more democratic structures. But a lot of those did start from workers putting pressure on the organization from within. And part of the Nonprofit Democracy Network is part of the goal is to like create resources and also normalize this. And because that gives power to workers to say, look, there's these 75 other organizations that have this more worker self-directed model or democratic model. Probably a lot of just like growing anecdotes about how effective an organization can be when it is democratic, that I think workers, if the board and the executive director are not on board with restructuring, you can put more like pressure on by sharing these examples. There's also like in those slides, lots of slides can be sort of pulled out as a single practice that you ask an organization to start implementing, just to start shifting the culture a little bit. So you might not be ready to completely restructure a nonprofit, but you could start restructuring meetings, and that can already start to change things, even just how meetings, the agendas are set and the facilitation happens. So like little by little, sort of cherry pick some of these practices and start to implement them. And, truthfully, there's a lot of people in positions of power where their ego or sense of security is really wrapped up in their position. And there's a lot of fear about changing that. But the more that you start to practice on a daily basis, more collaborative structures, people start to trust each other a little bit more and relax. So yeah, but that is a hard one. I mean, overall, trying to shift from business as usual to the revolution, it's a hard one. But yeah, I also want to see if I can get my head around some of these questions about sort of interrelationships between 501c3s and non-501c3s, like LLCs.
Actually, can I, while you're thinking of that, I see someone asked the question about multiple people within an LLC or within a partnership versus LLC. And we were in a collectively run LLC that operated like a cooperative, but we were essentially collectively run LLC. We weren't a 501c3, even though we had a fiscal sponsor to serve as the 501c3 part for grants. We weren't 501c3 because we were making political art, and there were some issues around us, the ramifications of that.
Mm-hmm.
We came into a couple problems over the course of a 6-year run before we sunset. One was that we made a mistake of early people helping out with tax stuff, and we thought we were a partnership and we were actually a LLC. And so yes, you can be a partnership of lots of people. There was like 9 of us in the core collective, but it meant that we ended up, because as I understood it, people in a partnership, if there's money carried over at the end of a year, they have to say that it's profit. And so we ended up in this like whole awful conundrum with like a bunch of us having to report income that wasn't actually income. And then if we got any money back from the organization to pay for that taxes, we actually had to report that as income the next year. So there was like no way to solve it. And then the side piece of it was when we finally started working as an LLC, there were some sort of still confused. I never quite understood where the tax thing was. So that's my setup for, I think, a lot of these questions around LLC sit in the tax space.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, since that one's fresh and you just described it, I'll address that a little bit. this is one of those major threshold decisions, yeah, especially for small collective groups, of whether to choose corporate tax or pass-through tax. So partnerships and LLCs default to pass-through taxation. So that kind of means like everything in your business passes straight through to all of you as individuals. There's no kind of collective account or collective pool of assets that's separate from you as individuals. And this is really important for cooperative groups that are trying to build a sense of collective wealth and collective asset building, is to have a space that feels separate. And so that's why corporate taxation, and for larger groups forming cooperative corporations, that's really helpful, is that the corporation holds assets and the corporation may or may not pay taxes on those assets, but you don't have to pass everything through to individuals. And so I think, Kate, you were probably just talking about sort of the awkwardness of, okay, well, we've built this collective pool of resources, but at the end of the year, we have to divvy it up among, even if we don't receive it, whatever money is like a surplus in the bank, we have to divvy it up among individuals and pay taxes on it, even if we don't receive it. And so that is a tension for a lot of small collective groups, is they don't want to have to do this divvy up process and pay tax on money they didn't receive and maybe they never want to receive because it's collective wealth. So that is often one of the deciding points that puts people over from being taxed as pass-through taxation, aka partnership taxation, over to corporate taxation, which then separates the assets from the individuals. Yeah, what else did I want to say about that? But this is one of these other threshold decisions that makes a big difference in your life, is that if you don't want to treat yourself as employees, you really have to stay in that LLC partnership pass-through taxation mode, where there is no separation between the business and the people. There's no separation between the people and the assets. You are all one and the same, working for yourselves. And that is like pivotal for a lot of groups, like handling payroll, workers' comp, overtime, timesheets. Oh, I hate this stuff in my own organization. You know, it really bogs us down and slows people down. But yeah, if you want to sort of separate out and build up a pool of collective assets separate from the individuals involved, then it's kind of like the individuals are working for the corporation. It's creating that separation, and then it's creating that relationship of employer employee, and you have to, you know, people are entitled to the protections of employment law in that case. So over the years, it's been one of the biggest deciding factors. Can you handle the administrative stuff there?
Maybe just to add to that, because I think that was a helpful setup for my question, and maybe just give it a little more context, is I am part of a 501c3 that's been around for almost 10 years and in the art space. And we've started doing more media work and film work, and want to start and are now starting an LLC because like you need different funding models to work in the film industry. But we're hoping that the production company can support the nonprofit. And so we talked to an accountant who said, like, to avoid the pass-through taxes, not accounting for like a nonprofit donation, that the nonprofit could be a member of the LLC and take its own sort of pass-through. But I haven't been able to find a nonprofit attorney to verify that that wouldn't be problematic for the nonprofit.
Well, I don't know if I'll address this directly, though I will say over the years, it's come up for a lot of our clients, whether they're nonprofits or co-ops, this question of should they form an LLC for part of their activities or to hold part of their assets. One of the major reasons it does happen is when there are outside owners who are going to be part of that enterprise with the organization. And you were just saying like something about the financing of it. If there's like individuals helping finance a project and they want partial ownership and control over it, you're nodding. So that's, yeah. I guess that's
like the film industry just has like its own awful hierarchical ownership models that we're trying to subvert, but we kind of have to have enough of a model that mirrors it to be able to work with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Although, yeah, when there is this thing, I feel like LLCs are kind of like the emperor's clothing. A lot of people take them seriously and think they're necessary. And then if you form one, people think, oh, you're serious, you're an LLC. But that is a creation of the legal profession. In my opinion, it's a thing. Like creating LLCs just creates layers of complications, which creates more jobs for lawyers and makes everything kind of more professionalized, technocratic, and less accessible and participatory overall. So a lot of times I'm in a position where a bunch of lawyers are like, you should form an LLC and separate out this activity. And I'm like, do we really have to? I mean, LLCs also protect the parent entity from liability if, you know, something really goes wrong or if the LLC loses a lot of money. But what it means is that you'd have now two entities, each have to have separate governance, separate books, separate tax returns, separate bank accounts, and the layers and layers of administration just can really slow a group down. But yeah, so the thing about an LLC that's owned by a nonprofit is if it's a pass-through entity, whatever, pass-through taxation, whatever the LLC is doing, particularly if it's controlled by the nonprofit, kind of passes through as an activity attributed to the nonprofit. And a nonprofit is supposed to operate primarily for charitable purposes. And so if you do have a subsidiary LLC that you control and you're engaging in a lot of like non-charitable, just commercial enterprises through it, it can jeopardize tax exempt status. I don't know. I mean, this is like what I've learned and read, although I don't know of a specific example of that ever happening. I just tend to steer people away from forming LLC subsidiaries altogether. And maybe there's some risk in not separating out the activities, but I think there's a lot of risk in creating too much administrative complication.
So, hi, everybody. This is a great conversation and glad to be part of this. My name is Asta Petkevičiūtė, and I work with Social Impact Commons. We are the first capacity builder of fiscal sponsors. And we do talk quite a bit with fiscal sponsors about Model A's versus Model C's versus Model L, which is the component of nonprofit and LLC working together. The places where we usually recommend it is only if there is a very large nonprofit that might be bringing in a lot of risk and might want to move out of the fiscal sponsorship relationship in a couple of years. Then you could form an LLC to be able to move that structure around from one place to another. So that's usually one of the reasons. The other is really more about risk, especially if it's a very large nonprofit, a very significantly larger assets in comparison to fiscal sponsor. But happy to talk a little bit more about some of the components, and I'm really glad to see your toolbox because we spend a lot of time talking about for-profit, nonprofit, cooperative structures with both fiscal sponsors and fiscal sponsees. So really, and working on specifically a toolbox for fiscal sponsors, because our interest is to make nonprofit industry a little bit more in more of a partnership and make fiscal sponsorship a little bit less of a well-kept secret and more of one of the ways of operating and one of the revenue streams for nonprofits as well.
That's great. Thank you so much, Asta. I'm really glad to hear that because I kind of just want to tell every nonprofit that I know that it should be doing fiscal sponsorship to support the momentum of so many grassroots projects that are emerging. And most nonprofits don't see themselves as going into that intentionally, but it would really serve so much. And Sustainable Economies Law Center didn't mean to be a fiscal sponsor ourselves. We're a legal organization providing legal services. But then it's like, well, but here's a project that we could help start. And do we want to form a whole new organization? No. Well, okay, we can be the sponsor of it. And then next thing we knew, we were a fiscal sponsor of 6 things or 10, actually, depending on how you count them. So, but it's like such a service, like all of these groups that we've helped get off the ground, they're, sort of effortless for them, and just a little bit more added administrative effort on our part. So Yeah. And yeah, and I think there are times where spinning them off into their own entities is going to make a lot of sense because they may be large. In our case, we spun off a group because it was going to get government funding, and we like to criticize the government, this particular government agency. And it's like, you need to be on your own because we're not going to shut up. And so there could be political reasons why, things need to spin off. It was also that particular sponsee was about to get a $1.3 million grant, and we were like, ooh, it's a lot of money to flow through us right now. So yeah, so we also support groups to spin off when appropriate. All right.
I would just say, I sort of came on this because of a venture I'm going into in terms of art support for artists, but I put in the chat that I'm president of a almost 18-year-old arts organization. And we every year have this discussion about being a nonprofit or staying with a fiscal sponsor. And we've been through a couple, but I have to say the stress that it takes off the board by having a fiscal sponsor. We've been able also to really move into the technology world this year. We finally have a way that people can pay donations and dues online, which we could not do ourselves. So there's been, even though it's costing us and there's more of a cost us to exist, having a fiscal sponsor just it means my board is more willing to do things because they don't have all those other layers. So, and I know I was helping somebody the other day who had never heard of fiscal sponsors, and I found a whole list for them. There are fiscal sponsors across this whole country. And so I would just put in a shout out for fiscal sponsors that I think they have a real place and value and are worth the cost to us, because we can achieve a lot more by having a fiscal sponsor.
Thanks for chipping that piece in.
I'm not certain if you already addressed this because I stepped away for a second, but Kim was asking a question about international collectives who are working internationally. Did you see that one? Kim, do you want to ask that, or do you want me to read it?
Sure, I can chime in on that. I work with an organization that I'm now from this conversation thinking that maybe we need to be more expansive in our thinking of how we plan to organize, because it is based on a very collective ethos, but it's funded, it's sponsored by a corporation, but we're basically like an artist collective. But really where it's getting a little bit sticky is we work between the United States and Mexico. And so there's also this question of where does it make more sense to organize, because Mexico's just so heavy on the paperwork, especially when it comes down to admin, human capital. It's just very, human labor expensive. And there are different mechanisms of working back and forth, I think, but I just don't really know what they are. So maybe you've seen somebody else walk these steps.
Yeah. What about that? Yeah, every single country has a different framework for like what are the structures and what is a charity and what are the standards. And yeah, what to say about that? Since I know US law, I tend to encourage people to form in the US because it's the only thing I'm familiar with. We recently had a client that had an employee in Mexico, and so we had to do a little bit of research and just figure out what's that look like. And you really do have to kind of, like, every country that you're operating in, particularly if you have employees, like find out what their laws are and comply with them. There is I don't know if this is a resource yet, but maybe it will be. TechSoup is that donation and software discount organization that if they determine you to be a nonprofit, they will help you access like free or low cost software and hardware from all these big companies. And those big companies rely on them to determine what is or isn't a nonprofit. And so they are building, and I think that they're going to share kind of the wealth of knowledge of what are all the different nonprofit structures across the world, because they really are global and serve some hundreds of thousands of nonprofits globally. Yeah. But you really do have to get to know the place a little bit. We have a little bit of a sort of relationship in Ghana. One of our coworkers is doing cooperative development in Ghana and collaborating with groups there. Yeah, it definitely complicates things. Just checking out the chat. Feel free to highlight something you put in chat or someone put in the chat if you want me to address it.
Andrew, did your question get answered from early on?
Yes.
Awesome. And Dalton, your questions?
Just the one on like who can be board members versus like, can they be members of the organization or do they have to be non-interested parties?
Yeah. This whole concept of conflict of interest it starts to feel more and more ridiculous to me the more I realize that we are all interdependent. Like, there were not individual atomistic beings like transacting at arm's length with one another, not interested in each other's well-being. I don't know. It's just I have to deal with it both in the nonprofit world and in the lawyer world, all this conflict of interest concept stuff. But yeah, under California law, which is the main nonprofit law I can speak to, 51% of the board of a nonprofit has to be not interested or not financially interested, meaning the board members and their family members don't get paid by the nonprofit. And so there's that, which a lot of times a group of people organizing a project, it's kind of awkward. You have to kind of go find other people to be on your board who aren't involved or not going to be paid by the organization. And that's always kind of an awkward fit. And so, I tend to suggest that people find friends who are very values aligned and supportive of worker self-determination or member self-determination, and they're going to sit on the board and provide oversight and gentle stewardship, but not intervene in what would ultimately be decisions made by the workers or the members. So yeah, what else did I want to say about that? And that, yeah, we help our clients draft board resolutions that tend to be phrased something to the effect of, it's in the best interest of our organization, it best advances our charitable purposes, it's the most viable option for us to pay one of our board members to do something, or to put the decision-making power in the hands of workers or members. Even if there is conflict of interest, still, like, the confluence of interest of letting people determine things for themselves best advances charitable purposes. I may not have said that very articulately, but I think self-determined groups of people ultimately make the best decisions for themselves and best serve our communities. And I think the nonprofit sector can put more control in the hands of communities and stop acting like we need these disinterested boards of directors making decisions about other people for them.
Georgia was asking about a slide, if you have a slide, or if you can talk about benefits of a cooperative.
Yeah, maybe I'll go back to sharing my screen because I did make all these slides and some of them are helpful.
Okay. Giving us a slide number.
Okay, yeah. No, let's see what we have here. So I'll just go through these really quickly. I put these like co-ops in 5-minute slides together. Or I should be able to talk about it in just 5 minutes. But yeah, that in California, we have a cooperative corporation as a kind of entity you can form. Most other states have something similar, but it's not always called a cooperative corporation, sometimes cooperative association, but some similarities across states, which is just that in many states, you cannot, one of the benefits is you can't call yourself a cooperative unless you form that entity. So a lot of groups, that is a deal breaker. Like they want to call themselves cooperative because it's cool to be a cooperative, and to let everyone know that. So cooperatives, like compared to nonprofits, can engage in any activity, whereas nonprofit public benefit corporations do need to have a public benefit orientation. Cooperatives are a good vehicle if you really want to engage in self-help and self-determination. As I was saying, like nonprofits can enable that, but it is an awkward fit because of all this conflict of interest, private benefit business that constrains a little bit what nonprofits do. Cooperatives compared to 501c3s allow you to influence politics galore if you want to. Cooperative entities have built-in democratic structures, so it's in the law and the statute that governs cooperatives that it needs to be 1 vote per member. And there's a lot of other mandatory procedures that ensure due process for members. In California, there's a built-in rule that prevents return on capital from exceeding 15% per year, which is a nice return, but at least people can't extract profits endlessly from co-ops in California. This is one of the major reasons why we've been helping form co-ops in California lately, is for groups that want to be able to raise capital from members of the community. There's an exemption that allows cooperatives to sell shares for up to $1,000 per person. And that is like so powerful when the co-op members can raise their own capital for their own work and not have to rely on other outsiders or banks to decide if they're worthy of it or not. And so securities are the rules that come up when you want to take other people's money and the assurances that they'll get it back, or expectation that they'll get it back. In other states, though, nonprofits have these exemptions. Not in California, but we have this co-op exemption. So it's basically the only form of legal crowd financing under California law, making it a very powerful option. Compared to nonprofits, co-ops and other entities can raise equity capital, which helps them leverage other kinds of financing. Nonprofits mostly can only raise capital through loans. And cooperatives often, most of the time, use subchapter T, which is the icing on the cake, which is it's a pretty decent tax category. It has lots of has a lot of flexibility as to like who pays taxes when and how. So without going into more detail about just a few misconceptions about co-ops, as I mentioned before, it's not all about consensus and long meetings. Like there's so many different ways to design governance. It doesn't have to be equal pay, although equal pay, we had that at the Law Center for most of our existence. Now we pay people more if they have like family support needs, but equal pay is awesome. Really changes the relationships in an organization. And co-ops can receive donations. And in fact, we've been trying to encourage more foundations to give directly to co-ops and helping them navigate the sort of the legal compliance for that so-called expenditure responsibility. And there's sometimes people operate under the belief that co-ops can't get in individual donations. Co-ops can. And in fact, most people don't even benefit from the charitable deduction. So it doesn't matter if they give to a 501c3 or co-op, it's all the same to most people what they donate to, that as far as the tax impact. Let's see, yeah, employment law is often a decider if you're going to go co-op corporation or not. So with a co-op corporation, as I mentioned, it's a corporation. People tend to have to treat themselves like employees if they're working for it. Oh, and this is one of the major benefits of 501c3s is that they can more easily have volunteers without a volunteer saying, you know, hey, I should be treated as an employee. It's not very safe to have volunteers in a for-profit business, including cooperatives. But there are ways to do it. So that was my super fast co-op. So it's not as fast as I wanted, but hopefully helpful. The related, there's a sort of set of similar nonprofit slides is like why go the nonprofit route. I will just name, I'll name a couple of those really quickly because a lot of people don't think about it, but yeah, The desire to have volunteers is often a reason people go 501c3 rather than co-op. Like that is sometimes the decider. And then the other, this is a big one. If the staff needs student loan forgiveness, working for a 501c3 really helps with that. And for some people, this is absolutely the deal breaker. If you have 200,000 in like grad school debt or whatever. We have a cooperative that we work closely with where one of their staff is in fact a staff of our organization working for the co-op because loan forgiveness is really important to her. So through partnerships, nonprofits and co-ops can help each other achieve the best of both worlds. And that's one of our, I guess you can call it a hack to help someone in a cooperative get access to loan forgiveness. But yeah, there's a handout that I linked to somewhere in here that helps navigate this sort of key decision between co-op and nonprofit, because it really is a big one.
There was one question early on. I don't know if you addressed this. Samantha asked, and I'm sure other people are wondering, if they're looking for a lawyer, is it possible to work with you or your colleagues, or how could that happen?
So Sustainable Economies Law Center, 3 times per month, we have a legal cafe, which is a quote unquote walk-in and currently virtual legal advice clinic. You can sign up on our website. They sell out. Each one quote unquote sells out, even though it's free or maxes out its registration. So you can look on our calendar and sign up for one further out. But truthfully, we don't have capacity to take a lot of clients to work through like the legal steps of like entity formation and contracting. So we do tend to give people a list of other lawyers with similar expertise. And we also, if you go on our website and click on something, might be programs. We have a fellowship program that currently has close to 50 lawyers around the US, Puerto Rico, and Canada who are kind of part of our network. We have gatherings for them twice a year. They get a lot of training from us. They provide a lot of mentorship to each other. And so you get there's a lot of like-minded lawyers who are our fellows. And so particularly if you're in a state other than California, you'll probably need to be looking for lawyers elsewhere. So long story short, it's kind of like one-time advice, lots of resources on our website, and probably we can't take most clients, but if we can, you can ask someone in the legal cafe if that's a possibility.
Thank you so much, Janelle. And folks, of course, have like 300 slides that they can be referring to for now. Plus, there's so many different resources on your website. So thank you so much. We're so appreciative. Folks, I dropped a link to the feedback form. We really do. I do, and I will share with Janelle, we really do value your feedback, your thoughts. So please do take a moment to fill that out. I'll also send that link around when I send the recording. And I also dropped in the chat, and our upcoming workshop is going to be led by the creators of the O Positive Festival. It's about exchanging art for medicine, medicine for art, or whatever you like. It should be a really cool presentation, another toolkit presentation. And I want to mention too that Selk and O Positive and Ampled from last week are all investees of CCI's Ambitious initiative. So I put a link to that earlier if you're curious about Ambitious and find out about how CCI is supporting alternative economy efforts and solidarity economy efforts nationally. Janelle, anything you want to say before we say goodbye?
No, it was lovely hanging out with you all and connecting. And yeah, just grateful for this opportunity. Thanks all.
We're grateful too. Thank you everybody so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much, Allison.
No, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye. Say hi to Robin.